Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk to you about some of the projects and initiatives that my organization, Archives for Europe Foundation, is involved in. We are also a partner in the ECOS project, so even though we are not from the museums part, but kind of covering one of the other domains. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. But before I go into the question of the European level, I wanted to take us back not only in time but also in space. So focusing on Hungary, our wonderful host country, and looking at how aggregation developed throughout the 2000s essentially in this country. And the very first initiative in Hungary actually already started in the last century, in 1997, the John von Neumann Digital Library, which was kind of the first initiative bringing together cultural heritage from different institutions and looking specifically at supporting institutions with digitalization projects and general collection management and preservation activities. There also are a few initiatives here at our host institution today at the Hungarian National Library, which are still active. So one is dating even further back to 1994, the very beginnings, the Hungarian Electronic Library and the Electronic Periodicals Archive, with a few others that are still run by the National Library here. One part of the John von Neumann Digital Library was the Digital Literary Academy. So that was specifically looking at published work from Hungarian literary creative people. And that is now run by the Patafi Literary Museum, so one of the other events host during the next few days. There also were a few initiatives from other domains, so we've got the audiovisual and sound domains represented in essentially three initiatives here, so the National Audiovisual Archive and then the Hungarian World Newsreels Online and the Gramophone Online projects. All of them are still active, dating from the mid-noughties. And kind of focusing on the audiovisual and sound heritage of Hungary. There also are a few initiatives from the archive sector. So there's the Hungarian Archives portal, which initially originated on the local levels, but has now been extended to also include the National Archive, but also other archival institutions from all around the country. And there's a kind of a spin-off of that since nearly 10 years, the Digital Archives portal, which is specifically looking at the services of the National Archives, but also the Budapest City Archives. And last, I wanted to mention the National Digital Data Collection, which in itself doesn't exist anymore, so it was run between 2003 and 2011. There's an archive website that you can still have a look at. And that is probably kind of the first cross-domain aggregator that Hungary had. So it was collecting metadata from libraries, museums, archives, and other cultural heritage institutions. And it supported specifically digitization activities from all around cultural heritage. There was, during the time of the 2003 to 2011, initially taken over by the Neumann Library and then by the Hungarian National Digital Archive and Film Institute in 2011, when that was founded. And we will come back to that one at a later point. Zooming back out and looking at the European level, there also were quite a few activities going on at the same time as these Hungarian initiatives were ongoing. So there were some general projects with Minerva and Minerva Plus, with Michael and Michael Plus, and with the Athena projects, all kind of looking at networking, collaboration activities. We heard that earlier already in other speeches, that no one can do all of this by themselves, so it's always better to have collaborators and kind of try to work things out together. and also looking at aspects like multilinguality, which of course in Europe is a very important aspect to really kind of provide access to everyone, and generally looking at access conditions for cultural heritage. In the same time, there also were the first kind of research infrastructures that started, so ReAImagining, the digital research infrastructure for the arts and humanities, but also the European Holocaust research infrastructure, which are essentially kind of, let's say, related initiatives to digital heritage, because of course there is a lot of overlap between the humanities and what we are working with. Looking a little bit at the history of my own organization, if I may, that also kind of has its origins in that same time. So there was a council resolution on archives in the member states in 2003, which initiated the report on archives in the enlarged European Union. And that was specifically looking at aspects like access, but also preservation and also collaboration. That was published in 2005, and in this one report, only looking at the archives domain, they listed 47 cooperation and aggregation projects at that time in the different countries that they covered, plus 7 on European level. And that's only on archives, so you can imagine there was a lot going on in the other domains and libraries and museums around that same time. Not all of these projects have survived, unfortunately, but some have been kind of moved into other initiatives that are still ongoing. For Archives Portal Europe, the report was followed up by a council recommendation on priority actions to increase cooperation in the field of archives. And one of these priority actions was the creation of a gateway to European archives, which kind of gave the first initial two projects that were supported by the European Commission, the APLET and the APEX project between 2009 and 2015. And since 2015, the portal is run by the Archives Portal Europe Foundation with support from National Archives, who are the associates of the foundation. In parallel, and now we are coming kind of to the big players, there was of course also activity in the libraries world, and that started in 1997 with the Gateway project, Gateway and Bridge to Europe's national libraries, which developed further into what was then called TEL, the European Library, which had an extension project until 2007, but kind of at that same time merged into something that would become Europeana. So, based on the work that TEL did, there also was a letter signed by 6 heads of states asking the European Union for support of the further development of the European Digital Library. And that was a little bit kind of also looking at the initiatives that were ongoing at that point of time with Google digitizing all kind of books that they could get their hands on. And that was kind of a counterweight that the European Commission supported. Europeana then launched in November 2008 and has since been growing steadily. Following that initial with Europeana, there were 2 kind of framework recommendation and report documents from the European Commission, respectively expert groups on behalf of the European Commission. So there was the new Renaissance report, which specifically recommended that Europeana would be reinforced as the reference point for European culture online. And that was followed in the same year, in 2011, by a Commission recommendation on the digitalization and online accessibility of cultural material and digital preservation. In that context, there was a specific focus on audiovisual and sound materials, because that was the type of material that was at that point missing in Europeana. So there was essentially an annex which kind of listed target figures for each of the member states, generally, but also looking specifically at audiovisual and sound material. And that essentially helped the establishment of further aggregation initiatives on the national level, but also domain and thematic aggregators on the European level. That has led today to a network of 43 accredited aggregators towards Europeana, so the Europeana Aggregators Forum. We know there are more aggregators out there than just the ones that are accredited, but even with that, we kind of cover the whole European Union. We cover all the different domains that we have in cultural heritage. Unfortunately, the European Library, TEL, was kind of discontinued in 2016-2019, so that's now been incorporated and mainly run by Europeana itself. But there are also initiatives ongoing to kind of get national libraries specifically on board again. And for Hungary, those 43 accredited aggregators also include two initiatives born here. That is the Forum Hungaricum and the Museum Map aggregator at the National Museum. I've been talking a lot about aggregators, but what is aggregation? So what do we understand when we talk about aggregation? And the subtitle is a definition attempt, because I will see that there's more to this definition that is now showing up, and it is taken from the Europeana Glossary of Terms, where it says that an aggregator is an organization working with cultural institutions and collectors to gather authentic, trustworthy, and robust data. Aggregators make this content available to a broader audience via their own services, Europeana, and other infrastructures, for example, for education and research. When we break this down, this nice kind of compact definition of what an aggregator is, in kind of the three parts that I highlighted earlier, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And I have to say, most of the aggregators that we are working with in the European Aggregators Forum do that with like 1.5, 2 FTE. So it's really low kind of in terms of the personnel and staff that is involved, but there's a lot of activity going into that. And I just want to kind of detail a few things here. So work with cultural institutions, what does it mean? That kind of doesn't necessarily already go into the question of data transfer, but it's really kind of around fostering the use of standards, and that is not only metadata or description standards, but it's also around copyright and how to apply that accordingly. It's about digitization and making sure that when I digitize, those digital objects can be reused in different reuse scenarios. It's about exploring new tools and methods, and currently there's of course a big focus on 3D and on AI. Again, kind of the collaboration and cooperation aspect here. Co-creation of new dissemination and engagement options, and providing general capacity building and training opportunities. The second point then goes into the actual data transfer, and that's not like, okay, you give me your data and you just kind of put it on Europeana. There's a lot that needs to go into that. So it starts with trying to understand the local data formats, and we know that libraries, museums, archives all kind of use their own standards when they describe the objects that they hold. So that's kind of the first step, that you need to sit down and really understand how these standards are used in the different institutions. So helping to transform that to international standards that are used on the European level. In this context, there also is a lot of work going into ensuring data quality. Europeana has created a Europeana publishing framework that gives a little bit of an indication with regards to specifically supporting search and discoverability of the objects. And some aggregators also do a little bit of data enrichment that might be kind of normalizing dates so that you can use it in a date search. It might be adding linked open data, links for entities, so if there are persons named or place names or events that get kind of linked open data URI so that they can be referred to more easily. And all of that happens usually in a one-to-one and case-by-case support situation. I can say from our support in Europe that of course the support at the beginning when you onboard a new institution is higher than continued kind of collaboration, but still the time needs to be put in at some point. And when it comes to making data available that I mentioned earlier, might include the creation and maintenance of an aggregator's own website or other services like an API. It might include connecting the aggregator with other aggregators like Europeana. It might be sharing the content further. Often aggregators have their own agreements with cultural heritage institutions that they work with in order to how they share the data and to who. But of course, if the copyright is included in the metadata, then that should also give an indication of what you can or cannot do with the data as an aggregator. And then of course, then also kind of leads to the necessity to ensure the continued availability of all these services. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, some of the aggregation projects just have discontinued after the funding ran out. So there are a lot of situations right now in the Europeana context where we need to kind of re-establish the connections. So that's not always the easy thing. How does aggregation currently work? Essentially, the institution creates the descriptions, the metadata. It creates digitalization of the material. And the digital objects remain at the institution. So what needs to happen is that essentially kind of links to the objects are added into the metadata before it is being shared. And then essentially every aggregator will refer back to the institution's own website, hopefully also kind of leading to more traffic to the institution and more interest in the collections. The sharing of data might happen in one straight line, so it might just go to the national aggregator in the country, but it might also be that an institution is providing to a national aggregator and then to an international domain aggregator at the same time. And these aggregators then might be sharing the data with Europeana again. So it's all kind of going in one direction, so there's not really kind of a redirectional sharing of, for example, enriched data with the institutions at the moment, and it essentially kind of all leads to Europeana without the question being answered whether or not all the data that exists at one of the previous points really ends up in Europeana. I also want to mention the two big initiatives that Mrs. Stacher already mentioned earlier, so the Common European Data Space for Cultural Heritage and the European Collaborative Cloud for Cultural Heritage. Luckily, I can kind of go through these slides now very quickly because it essentially kind of gives you the same information that you've already heard. So the data space, as mentioned, is funded under the Digital Europe program. It is in the context of 14 other sectoral data spaces, so part of the digital strategy of the European Union. And maybe one thing that I want to kind of emphasize is that the data space, similar to Europeana, is still very much looking at reuse scenarios and enabling reuse and democratization of access to the cultural heritage. And the core audience is not only the cultural heritage institutions that aggregators are working with, but also researchers, educators, creators, anyone who wants to use the nature of the digital cultural heritage in their own context. The challenge kind of moving forward for the data space is that while we can build on 15 plus years shared experience, that also means that we need to kind of review what went well, what didn't go so well, is there any possibility to improve, do we need to adapt to the new context and circumstances, and how do we best do this? The European Collaborative Cloud for Cultural Heritage and the ECOS project is more kind of looking at the research and innovation aspects at the moment. And it was mentioned that, of course, there also is testing of what the cloud will be developing, but it's still kind of in the earlier stages, let's put it like that. And while the cloud is also looking at access, its main audience currently is kind of more on the, let's say, internal side of cultural heritage institutions. So it's looking at the researchers in the institutions and the cultural heritage professionals, and enabling them with the tools that are being created in the cloud to prepare their data in the best way for sharing it then later. And the challenge for the cloud is essentially kind of the other way around compared to the data space. So the cloud is starting from a blank slate, but on the other hand, it also needs to make sure that it's not inventing the wheel anew, because there are already kind of so many similar initiatives out there that have already tried specific things. When we now look at kind of shared challenges and also how they might affect aggregation, I wanted to mention one aspect that is Europe's triple transition, and specifically looking at the digital part. So the triple transition combines digital, social, and green. But as we are moving in a digital environment, I wanted to zoom in on that first part. And just wanted to reiterate the point of digital transformation, and we've heard that earlier. It is a journey that you should not go alone, but we also need to be aware of the fact that it's a journey that doesn't necessarily always have a defined end. So with all the developments that are ongoing, we know that from our kind of own personal lives, every day there seems to be something new, and that's the same also in these initiatives. So it's not like you do digital transformation and then you're done, but you do digital transformation in order to enable yourself and enable your organization to kind of improve step by step. And it's okay if that step by step is done in different paces by different institutions. So that's the other aspect that I wanted to mention. So capacity building is one of the activities that aggregators do, and we do it because we know there is a difference in digital skills levels in institutions that we're working with. There are the bigger institutions, mostly on national levels, who have the funding, who have a big kind of staff, who can kind of give their staff the necessary time to actually kind of dive into all these digital topics, while a smaller institution where you might just have one person doing everything just doesn't have the luxury to do that. So this is also a little bit about digital literacy, so kind of giving people the tools at hand that they can understand at least what is out there, and then decide what might be the perfect fit, so to say, for them. And that might be something very different for a small institution compared to a big institution. Towards the end of my speech, I want to just mention a few kind of hot topics, and I think they affect the data space as well as they do affect the cloud. And there are kind of questions to explore, so there are no defined answers to these yet. I think both of the initiatives are still trying to understand what it might mean in their context. And I want to start with one of the bigger things, and that is decentralization, which goes kind of hand in hand with the concept of data sovereignty and kind of the potential impact that this might have on data governance. And the definition here is one definition that was currently created in the data space, but I think is transferable also to the cloud. So we want to enable an increased offer of data sets and data services. So kind of not only having one central point where everything is kind of collated, but also enabling all the developments that happen on the outskirts of that to also be available to others. So diversification of actors and really kind of including all the potential partners that might be valuable to the users and might be providing services valuable to the users should be sitting on that table. That also includes what the data space concept calls intermediary and enabling services. So these are institutions and companies that might not necessarily be active in the data transfer themselves. So like aggregators are active in the data transfer with cultural institutions, but they might be providing tools and services that help in preparing the data. Diversification of data sharing and what we call data visiting pipelines is also a concept of decentralization. So this idea that it might be okay, like it currently is the case with the digital objects themselves, that certain parts of the data remain at the source, and trying to use linked open data and similar approaches to kind of connect to those sources without having to transfer data from here to there, to there, to there, which also, of course, has a certain impact on the environment. We are constantly copying data from one place to the other. We certainly will need to have another look at how we can kind of balance that and how we can kind of measure the impact of one approach towards another. But there might be something in there. And then the last point is about being participatory and collaborative, and that goes into the points that were also mentioned earlier with regard to diversity and inclusivity, so kind of making sure that all the professionals in the cultural heritage sector can contribute if they want to. I mentioned the aspect of governance, and that I think is the example where we see the differences between these two initiatives very clearly. So the data space with the European initiative already has kind of an informal governance, so to say, between the three pillars, the European Foundation, the European Aggregators Forum, and the European Network Association, while the cloud is still needing to develop their governance approach. But essentially, both of them have this idea of including communities, including not only the cultural heritage institutions, but also the users in their governance approaches. Then, of course, with regard to having different initiatives around, we need to talk about interoperability. And there are different levels of interoperability that we can look at. There's the technical interoperability, so ensuring that we are using standardized protocols for data exchange and then using connectors that can be understood from both sides, so to say, but also from other initiatives. There's semantic interoperability, so that looks at the data models, standards, and formats, and ensures that they are understood at both ends. And again, the use of linked data is something that is being explored in this context. So is there really the need to transform from one metadata standard into another, or can we use the power, so to say, of linked open data to connect the different types of data? And then there's organizational interoperability, and that is currently to a certain extent covered by the fact that several partners in the Data Space Consortium are also partners in the ETHOS Consortium. So there is a little bit of an overlap between both initiatives from the organization side of view. But of course there are new actors that might be coming in, and we need to consider how that might impact the roles and responsibilities throughout the whole initiative. And then there's just a point that I wanted to make about digital preservation. And we're talking about preservation, but most of the times we're talking about preservation of the actual object, not necessarily about digital preservation, at least in the context of these bigger initiatives. That is because the data space is currently very much looking at the presentation data, so something that is specifically created to be used and be shared outside, not necessarily what the institutions might have in order to preserve that in their own assistance. And the cloud is more looking at the tools around that. So providing tools to prepare, but also providing tools to ensure preservation and not necessarily do preservation. So that might be something that both of these initiatives need to kind of have a closer look at some point. Eventually, and that's my last point, all of this comes down to the communities, to the networking experience. We heard that earlier. Collaboration is key, and that includes not only the partners of the initiatives, but also the data providers, and specifically the users. So looking at democratization of access to cultural heritage, and thereby enabling users to use and reuse according to their own needs, and hopefully contributing to an open and creative society by doing so. And the last one also was mentioned earlier. I've got this here with QR codes instead of links. If you're not already a member, please join the European Network Association. There are different communities, different topics that you can kind of select from depending on what you're interested in. And please follow the ECOS project as that is currently kind of taking up speed and certainly will provide new and interesting things in the next few months. And with this, I'm done. Hopefully still in time. And looking for questions or any comments if anyone has one. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. It was a really comprehensive presentation, and it's helped me a lot already because I had a really I was aware of all these initiatives, but it was very helpful kind of seeing them put together and you know, explained so thoroughly. So I was thinking a lot about digital preservation, but also digital sustainability, and it's something we talk about. My name is Maria, and I work for the Heritage Management Organization. We train people on how to manage heritage, but we're also involved in SHIFT, which is a project funded by the Horizon Europe program, which is all about using new technologies to make cultural heritage more accessible and inclusive and, of course, appealing. So we're thinking a lot about among many other things, about sustainability and interoperability and how this is going to work. But I was also going back to thinking about cultural heritage professionals and thinking that you're talking a lot about training and democratization and digital literacy, which is obviously the kind of foundation of the challenges that especially smaller institutions may be facing. So I was also concerned about how we're thinking about training sustainability, because we're seeing, for example, we were involved in another project called Teach for Europe, and we trained a lot of people across the Balkans. But it seems to me that all this training is already obsolete, as all these very new tools have entered our lives from AI, you know, and different models being worked on. So I was wondering, how do you think it's already hard for cultural heritage professionals to keep up with all these infrastructures with bits kind of being added, but how can they also keep up with their training so that they can actually make use of all this fantastic infrastructure that European citizens are essentially putting together and funding?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think I can answer it to a certain extent from both initiatives' perspectives. So, starting with the data space, we have recently launched the European Academy. So that's an e-learning system where essentially all the existing resources at some point will be collated. And in this context, there also will be a certain review regime set up. So kind of to your point about, is this still kind of relevant? Is this still up to date? Do we need to kind of, I don't know, include new legislation, or do we need to kind of include a new tool that will be built in? it very much is depending on the availability of the subject matter experts, as we call them, so colleagues who do copyright or who work with specific tools to actually kind of do the update then. But in theory, the kind of thing is included. And I think the same is now being started in the cloud context. So the work package doing capacity building has just kind of started its work, and one of the first things that we are going to do is establish some principles around capacity building, and that also includes kind of a continuous process of needs and gaps analysis. So trying to kind of establish what are the things that are most needed in order to support the sector with the digital transformation. I hope that answers your question.
Hello, Kerstin, thanks for your presentation. I would like to ask something regarding the centralization strategy that you were mentioning, especially what's the commitment to open source tools for all these enabling services, well, on all the value chain, what's the commitment, what recommendation regarding open source tools? Is everything advised to be open source, or what's?
So both the cloud and the data space are built on open source principles. So essentially all the core services that have been developed in the data space or that will be developed in the cloud will be open source. In terms of diversification, I think that's still a question to be answered, whether open source will be one of the requirements towards kind of other tool providers, or if there can be some leveling in there. But I think the preferred model would be open source, also for kind of external providers of tools.
Thanks.
One more question.
Very interesting talk. I have a question concerning the data. So there will be on the internet. And the museum, for example, if you want to use their data, do they have like rights on the data? Can we like modify? Should we do collaboration? Are they open to share this type of data? What are the what are these obstacles that you encounter when you did this type of data repository for culturally individuals? Because sometimes, because we work with museums and we realize that they don't want to modify also, for example, for painting and things like this, because we are doing colorization, so they don't want us to do any type of colorization of painting. So if this data are available, how does it work? What is the obstacle that you encounter?
Yeah, so I think that's certainly something that we also hear in the different contexts of aggregators, and I think aggregators have grown very aware of what they can or cannot do or shouldn't do, so let's say, with the data just in their own context. Because at the moment, essentially, as I mentioned, there is not really a way to give that enriched data back to institutions. So it stays in the aggregator context, but the institution doesn't really have any benefit from it. So that is something that in the context of decentralization is an aspect that we would want to explore. So does decentralization allow us to more easily kind of connect the different data sets? So the institution has one data set and that has been provided, let's say, to a national aggregator, and then the national aggregator has enriched the data with translations. And that translation data set is something that is kind of identified as enrichment, identified as being created by the aggregator, but there is a possibility for the original data set at the institution to be linked to that if they want to. So looking at these kind of different possibilities in decentralization is one of the things that we want to explore. I can't really tell you how this will pan out in the end, but that's the idea at the moment.